All right, I want to talk to you about rational inequalities. They're called rational inequalities because you have a polynomial over polynomial inequality because you have this less than sign. And to do a problem like this, you have to get it in this form. If it's not in this form, you have to go through the process of getting it to be in the form. And I describe this form as factored side, zero side. You can have different inequalities here. You can have a greater than, a less than, but it still has to be factored side, zero side. You've heard me say those exact words in another context, but you need it in this case. So if the problem hadn't started this way, I still would have had to do that. All right. Now, I tried to outline the steps, and by writing all these steps out, I really am making this problem look a lot longer than they are in practice, but I just want you to understand the steps. Okay, I don't want to lose the problem until I absolutely need to. So there it is on the top of the screen. So step 1A, I call it, set the numerator equal to 0 to find where the expression equals 0. And this is just something that you know almost intuitively at this point. If you have a fraction where the numerator is equal to 0, it doesn't really matter what I put in the denominator, that fraction is going to be equal to 0. So basically what I'm saying is, if you set the numerator equal to 0, you're setting this entire fraction equal to 0. And because there's a zero side to this problem, well, 0 is going to be important. So just kind of going with something you know. I just made up the 7. It's not important to the problem. Just saying, you know that 0 on the top of a fraction makes the answer 0. All right. We're going to talk about something similar in a moment. All right. Set the denominator equal to 0 to find when the expression is undefined. So in other words, whenever this was in 4th grade or whatever, 6th grade, I don't know, when you were first told that you can't divide by 0 because something like 7 over 0 is undefined, we're kind of using that fact right now. If you set the denominator equal 0, you're discovering what makes this expression undefined. All right, so we did that. In this case, we got 4 numbers. And now what do we do? Well, plot the points that we discovered on a number line. So you can still see the -5 right here. I plotted that. The -1 up here, I plotted that. The 3 I plotted. The 7 I plotted. Well, in order on the number line, that's important too, but plot them on a number line. And notice what I did, just a note to myself here, above each of these points. Remember, the ones in the denominator were where the thing is undefined. I'm going to need to be aware of where I'm going to need to distinguish these points. So these came from the denominator, the -5 and the 7. And these came from the numerator, the 3 and the 1. So the ones came from the numerator are zeros. That's what the z's stand for. And undefined. The ones came from the denominator are undefined. That's what that stands for. All right. Now that we have this written out, 2A, test any interval. I always like to go to the far right. That might not be intuitive to most people, but I really just, when I do this, I always come way off to the right over here. So I'm going to test a number, well, greater than 7, so 8 or higher. So I went ahead and tested 10. Now when I say test, we don't really need to know the number. We just want to discover the sign. That's all this is for. So I went ahead and put in 10 for x, and I realized that 10 plus 1 has an answer. Of course, it's 11, but I didn't even record that. I just recorded it's positive. 10 minus 3 is positive. 10 plus 5 is positive. 10 minus 7 is positive. So 4 positives is positive. It stops right there. All right. So what I do with that information is I write plus, plus, plus. Now, the next step, and I could have written it up there, I feel like, but the next step is if you get plus, plus, or if you get minus, 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 whatever you get, switch the sign in the neighboring interval. So if this was all pluses, it's going to be all minuses. Going to be all pluses, all minuses, all pluses. And this is a pattern we've seen before. You're just switching signs. I say we saw it before. First day handout, there was a situation where we looked at patterns and the pattern switch signs. Okay, so these always switch signs between the points that we previously laid out. And then I called this step 3. Shade based on the given inequality. So this particular problem, this particular example had a less than or equal to 0. So you have to put this into words. In other words, what does it mean when you say less than 0? Well, that means negative. And what does it mean when you say equal to 0? Well, that means 0. So this is the inequality. I haven't shaded yet. Let me shade in blue here. But where am I going to shade? Well, since the original problem said less than 0, I'm going to shade any intervals that are negative. So if you ask me, where did the negative come from? I'll say, you know what? It came from less than 0. If it said greater than 0, I would have shaded the positives. All right. And then since it says or equal to 0, I want to shade the zeros. I do have a typo here. Man, I thought I copied this from up above here. Yep. All right. So if you remember, 3 was a 0 for this problem and undefined. So my mistake here. This was a 0 and this was undefined. You just copied it wrong. All right. Why is that important? Well, I want to shade the zeros, so I want to shade this. I definitely do not want to shade where it's undefined. I normally don't cross these out, but I'm just trying to emphasize, don't shade those. All right, so I have the answer, almost. The book doesn't seem to like to use the old style of open circles and filled in circles, or the website. The website uses a square bracket and a parenthesis. So, store that. And a parenthesis instead, all right? And this is important because you are going to select these things from a multiple choice a diagram, and sometimes the only difference between the right answer and the wrong answer is a square bracket instead of a parenthesis. But I'll just say it this way. The undefineds always get parentheses. You don't know which way they're going to face until you know where you're going to shade, but always get parentheses at the undefineds and a square bracket at the zeros. And to emphasize again, that's a 0. I had it typed wrong. All right, so that's the illustration, that's the graph, and that's what you come up with first. And then in interval notation, well, here it is. So remember how intervals work. They work the same way they've worked since the first time we talked about them. If you have an interval, you want the minimum comma maximum always in the middle, and the parenthesis is when you don't include the value, and the square bracket is when you do include the value. So I want to say, in practice, all you write down on a problem like this is pretty much just, this much ink, right? Just about that much. I mean, there's not much to write down on a problem like this. You're just putting layer upon layer upon layer on this one line. Now, the book does sometimes use more than one line, but I think if you know all the rules that I laid out here, especially the idea of plotting all the numbers and switching the signs, then you can do this in as short of process as I did it. I will have to explain. We have seen patterns before, only because we previewed the idea of patterns with Pascal's triangle and such. The book hasn't gotten there yet. The book never talks about patterns until the very last section of the book. So the book will not say, if you have plus, 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 switch to minus, 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 switch to plus, 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 switch to minus, 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 switch to plus, plus. It won't say that yet, because students normally at this page or this section have not talked about patterns. We have. The pattern's not complicated, but the book doesn't use patterns yet. So I just want to emphasize that if you know patterns, if you know this, this problem can be done in just this much space. Plot the undefines, plot the zeros, test the point, switch the signs, shade where you're supposed to shade. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it doesn't take that much space. All right. So those are absolute value inequalities. And we have a few of those, and we're even previewing some from, I think it's chapter 7. So with this in mind, take a look at those videos and those problems, and keep in mind what you're looking for based on the inequality that you're given. All right. Rational inequalities.